Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Tonight we retaking a stroll through the bustling streets of ancient Rome. Not the polished marble of senatorial halls or the grandeur of temples, but the noisy, smoky, and chaotic alleys where ordinary Romans grabbed their meals on the go. Forget the elegant banquets of emperors. This is where you find the real Roman junk food. Rome was a city constantly on the move. With over 1 million inhabitants at its peak, not everyone had the luxury of cooking at home. In fact, many lived in cramped insula, apartment blocks where fire hazards made private kitchens a rarity. That is where the thermopolia came in. Small street-side shops with counters lined with big clay jars sunk into them, brimming with hot stews, wine, bread, or spiced snacks. For the working poor, soldiers off duty, or anyone too busy to cook, these stalls were the lifeline of daily food. Imagine the scene: steam rising from bubbling pots, the smell of garum, the infamous fermented fish sauce hanging in the air, vendors shouting out their specialties, and customers jostling for space at the counter. You could grab a hunk of bread dipped in olive oil, some lentil stew, a piece of cheese, or even roasted nuts sold in paper-like wrappers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was fast, cheap, and filling. The Roman equivalent of grabbing a burger or slice of pizza on a busy afternoon. And just like today, not everyone approved. Wealthy Romans sneered at street food, seeing it as dirty, common, and unrefined. Philosophers mocked those who ate on the go, claiming it showed a lack of discipline. But the popularity of thermopolia couldn't be denied. They were the beating heart of Rome's food culture, feeding thousands every day and leaving behind traces we can still see preserved in places like Pompeii. For the average Roman, this was comfort food, not refined dining, but a taste of survival and familiarity. If salty stews and savory breads filled Roman bellies during the day, it was the sweet indulgences that truly delighted their hearts. The people of Rome had a soft spot for desserts, and though sugar as we know it was unknown to them, honey reigned supreme as the universal sweetener. It dripped into nearly everything: pastries, wine, nuts, and even savory dishes that blurred the line between meal and dessert. Street vendors catered to this craving with an array of tempting morsels. Simple honey cakes, golden and sticky, were among the most popular. Some were flat and chewy, others light and spongy, flavored with nuts, sesame seeds, or dried fruits. On festival days, vendors sold fried pastries drizzled with honey, the Roman ancestor of what we might call donuts or fritters. Children adored these sticky sweets, and adults weren't above sneaking a few themselves. Candied fruits were another favorite: dates stuffed with nuts, figs dipped in honey, and even quinces boiled down into thick jam satisfied cravings both rich and poor could enjoy. In some cases, these treats doubled as status symbols. A banquet host might serve exotic fruits preserved in honey or wine, showing off both wealth and connections to far-off trade networks. And of course, wine itself was sweetened, sometimes with honey, sometimes with herbs and spices, to create mulsum, a kind of spiced honey wine that blurred the line between drink and dessert. Sweet, intoxicating, and easy to overindulge in, it was served both in taverns and at feasts, ensuring that Roman evenings ended with sticky lips and light heads. To us, these treats may seem rustic compared to modern confections, but for Romans, they were luxuries that brightened the monotony of bread and porridge. They also reveal something timeless. No matter the century, people have always sought comfort in sweetness. If honey cakes and candied figs satisfied the sweet tooth, savory snacks ruled the streets of Rome. The bustling marketplaces and back alleys of the Eternal City weren't out just for serious trade. They were packed with food stalls that catered to the cravings of workers, soldiers, and children running underfoot. These were the true forerunners of what we might call fast food. One of the simplest yet most beloved snacks was bread topped with olive oil, herbs, and a scattering of salty cheese. Think of it as a rustic ancestor to modern pizza: cheap, filling, and flavorful enough to keep you coming back. Vendors also sold spiced sausages sizzling on skewers, their fat dripping onto open flames, filling the air with an irresistible aroma. For the hungry passerby, the smell alone was enough to draw coins out of a purse. Fried chickpea patties and lentil cakes were another common offering, especially for those who couldn't afford meat. Crispy on the outside and soft within, They were hearty enough to quiet a growling stomach, but cheap enough for even the poorest citizens. Street cooks sometimes flavored them with garlic, onions, or herbs, turning simple legumes into something memorable. Seafood, too, had its place in Roman snacking. Small fried fish or oysters could be eaten on the go, often with a dash of garum, the infamous fermented fish sauce beloved by Romans. To the uninitiated, its pungent smell might seem unbearable, but to them, it was the ultimate flavor booster, splashed onto everything from vegetables to meat. Of course, not all snacks were considered respectable. Some Roman sources mention street food being greasy, messy, or even of questionable hygiene, sold by vendors who catered to those too impatient or poor for home cooking. But despite the complaints, the popularity of these quick bites never waned. They were the fuel of laborers, the indulgence of travelers, and the guilty pleasure of anyone craving something salty and fast. In the end, these savory snacks show that convenience food is nothing new. Long before burgers and fries, the streets of Rome were already sizzling, frying, and serving up the flavors of indulgence. Food was only half the story on Rome's bustling streets. The drinks were just as important. And in the ancient world, beverages were never just about quenching thirst. They carried social meaning, health beliefs, and, in many cases, a touch of danger. Wine was the undisputed king of Roman drinks. But unlike the rich, undiluted glasses we might imagine, Romans almost always mixed their wine with water. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric, something only foreigners or the desperate would do. Still, wine was everywhere, served in taverns, poured at banquets, and even sold by street vendors from jugs. Cheap wine, sometimes sour or spoiled, was available for the poor, while the wealthy enjoyed vintages imported from Greece, Gaul, or Spain. To sweeten the harsher stuff, vendors added honey, herbs, or spices, turning even questionable wine into a marketable treat. Beer, though not as prestigious, had its place too, especially in the provinces. Soldiers stationed in northern Europe developed a taste for it, and when they returned to Rome, so did their fondness for barley brews. But among the Roman elite, beer was mocked as a barbarian's drink, inferior to the sophistication of wine. Still, on the streets, it kept thirsty workers refreshed. Street vendors weren't just selling food and drink. They were part of the rhythm of Roman daily life. Their cries echoed through crowded forums and neighborhoods, each shouting about fresh bread, hot sausages, or sweet mulsum. Many Romans ate on the go, grabbing a bite before heading to work, during breaks at the baths, or while socializing in taverns. Eating at home was not always an option, especially for the poor who lacked proper kitchens. The streets themselves became their dining room. But not everyone approved. Some writers of the time sneered at street food culture, complaining about greasy fingers, drunken brawls in taverns, and the moral decay of people eating hastily instead of dining properly. Yet for the majority, grabbing food and drink from vendors was simply practical. It fit the fast pace of urban life in the Empire's capital. So whether it was watered wine, cheap ale, or a quick snack from a noisy vendor, Romans lived a life surprisingly familiar to us today. Busy, crowded, and always fueled by food on the move. If the streets of Rome offered daily indulgence, festivals and feasts turned that appetite into a spectacle. Romans didn't just eat to live. They celebrated food as an essential part of life, as grand theater. And nowhere was this clearer than during public holidays, religious rites, and private banquets. Saturnalia, perhaps the most famous Roman festival, was a week of revelry where social rules were flipped upside down. Slaves dined beside masters, gambling and drinking were openly encouraged, and the streets overflowed with laughter, music, and of course, food. Honey cakes, fried treats, roasted meats, and gallons of wine defined the season. Moderation was forgotten. Indulgence was the rule. For many, Saturnalia was the one time of year when life's harsh hierarchies softened under the haze of excess. Banquets hosted by the elite took indulgence to another level. Wealthy Romans prided themselves on offering rare delicacies to impress their guests. Dormice stuffed with nuts and herbs, oysters shipped in from distant coasts, or even exotic birds. Between courses, sweet fritters dripping with honey or candied fruits provided sugary interludes while slaves refilled cups with endless streams of wine. Guests reclined on couches, eating with their hands while musicians played and dancers entertained. To leave a banquet stuffed to the point of discomfort wasn't shameful, it was proof that the host had succeeded in showing off his wealth. But excess often came with criticism. Writers like Seneca mocked the gluttony of the upper classes, describing vomitoria, spaces where overfed guests might relieve themselves to make room for more. Whether exaggerated or not, these accounts painted Roman feasts as both spectacular and grotesque, celebrations of abundance teetering on the edge of absurdity. Even the common people joined in during festivals. Markets overflowed with cheap treats, nuts, sausages, honeyed breads, so everyone, even the poor, could partake in the sense of abundance. Taverns did booming business, serving watered wine by the jug as songs and arguments spilled into the streets. For Romans, overindulgence wasn't just tolerated, it was ritualized. To eat and drink beyond reason was, in a way, to honor the gods, to revel in the fleeting joy of being alive, and to forget, just for a night, the struggles of daily survival. For all their love of sweet honey cakes and sizzling street sausages, Romans also knew that indulgence carried a cost. Ancient medical writers, philosophers, and even satirists often warned against the dangers of overeating and drinking too much, painting vivid pictures of the consequences that came from giving in too easily to appetite. Physicians like Galen, one of Rome's most influential medical thinkers, linked gluttony with illness. He wrote about how too much heavy food, rich meats, greasy pastries, and overly sweet treats could upset the body's delicate balance of humors, leaving a person sluggish, bloated, or feverish. Vomiting, indigestion, and weakness were all seen as signs of overindulgence. While medical knowledge was far from modern science, the Romans clearly understood that excess was dangerous. Philosophers such as Seneca and Cicero took the warnings further, treating gluttony as a moral failing. To them, the man who could not control his appetite was no better than a slave to his stomach. In their eyes, true strength came not from feasting at banquets, but from moderation and discipline. The eternal image of the drunken noble or the staggering street drunk was used as a cautionary tale, proof that without restraint, even the mighty could fall into disgrace. Ordinary people also recognized the risks. Stories circulated of men who drank themselves into stupors and froze in the streets, or of revelers who drowned after collapsing into fountains or barrels of wine. Satirists mocked the image of the perpetually drunk Roman who could barely walk, but still demanded another cup. To be remembered as a glutton or drunkard was to carry a stain of shame. And yet, despite all these warnings, the temptation of indulgence was irresistible. Bread, honey, wine, and street snacks were too woven into the fabric of daily life to ever disappear. The result was a culture in constant tension, moralists and doctors preaching moderation, while vendors, taverns, and banquet halls encouraged the opposite. In many ways, the Romans lived in the same paradox we do today, knowing excess is unhealthy, yet celebrating it anyway. For them, the price of indulgence was not just sickness or shame, but also the knowledge that joy was fleeting, and pleasure could quickly turn to pain. Though the empire itself eventually crumbled, the Roman appetite for indulgence never truly vanished. It left traces that still linger in the foods and traditions we know today. Rome's junk food culture, from sticky honey cakes to sizzling sausages, was more than a passing fancy. It set patterns for how later societies in Europe would snack, celebrate, and even define luxury. Take the humble street stall, for instance. Romans normalized the idea of grabbing food on the go, of eating in noisy public spaces rather than strictly at home. That tradition would echo through medieval markets, Renaissance fairs, and eventually the bustling street vendors of modern cities. The quick bite between errands, the guilty pleasure eaten standing up. These behaviors have ancient roots in the Eternal City. The Roman sweet tooth also endured. Honey remained the dominant sweetener in Europe until sugar arrived centuries later, and many of the empire's confections, candied fruits, nut-stuffed dates, fried fritters, can still be found in Mediterranean cuisines today. Even Mulsum, the honeyed wine of Rome, has modern echoes in spiced or fortified wines enjoyed at festivals and holidays. Their banquets, too, set the stage for Europe's later aristocratic feasts. The idea of hosting elaborate meals where food was not just sustenance but performance, where guests judged the wealth, taste, and status of their hosts by the extravagance of the spread, came directly from Roman dining culture. The tradition of feasting as both celebration and competition is a legacy that lasted well into medieval courts and beyond. And perhaps most enduring of all was the Roman paradox itself, the tension between indulgence and discipline, between the joy of the feast and the warnings of moralists. That struggle remains strikingly familiar. Even today we balance celebrations of food, birthdays, holidays, festivals, with constant reminders of moderation, health, and restraint. In the end, Rome's junk food wasn't just about taste. It was about identity, culture, and the eternal human desire to sweeten life's hardships with a bite of pleasure. Their legacy lingers every time we reach for a snack, every time a feast turns into overindulgence, and every time we wrestle with the same question they did 2,000 years ago. Is a little excess the price of truly living? If ordinary Romans indulged in honey cakes and sausages, the upper classes turned excess into legend. Their feasts weren't tea-just meals. They were spectacles so extravagant that historians and satirists could not resist recording them for posterity. These banquets became symbols of both Rome's grandeur and its moral decay. One of the most infamous names tied to gluttony was Emperor Vitellius. Ancient writers claimed he sometimes hosted 4 banquets a day, each stuffed with delicacies that stretched the imagination. Peacock brains, flamingo tongues, and rare fish were said to appear on his table, carried in by exhausted slaves. Whether exaggerated or not, such tales painted him as a man consumed by appetite, a ruler whose hunger reflected his lack of discipline. Then there was Trimalchio, a fictional character immortalized in the Roman novel Satyricon. Though not a real figure, his banquet reflected the absurd reality of Roman excess. Dishes were presented in outlandish ways, like a roasted pig stuffed with sausages spilling from its belly, or food arranged to mimic constellations in the night sky. Guests reclined in drunken stupors while entertainers performed, the whole affair blending comedy with grotesque spectacle. Petronius, the author, intended it as satire, but the caricature struck close to the truth. Real or imagined, these feasts highlighted the dangers of indulgence. They became morality tales repeated for generations, proof that unchecked appetite could corrupt even emperors. Philosophers like Seneca used these stories to contrast the simplicity of a virtuous life with the decadence of the elite, arguing that Rome's decline was mirrored in its dining halls. Yet for all the criticism, the fascination remained. The stories of flamingo tongues and endless wine casks captured the imagination of later generations, becoming part of the myth of Rome itself. They remind us that food is never just nourishment. It is culture, power, and performance, capable of defining how history remembers us. For all the legends of flamingo tongues and honey-drenched feasts, most Romans lived far from the world of emperors and elites. Their diet was not a parade of exotic luxuries, but a daily balancing act of survival, convenience, and the occasional indulgence when fortune allowed. The backbone of the Roman diet was simple: bread, porridge, and legumes. A day might begin with a quick bite of panis, dense bread often dipped in olive oil or accompanied by cheese. At midday, many Romans grabbed food from Thermopolia, relying on lentil stews, chickpea patties, or roasted nuts to keep hunger at bay. Evening meals at home, when families could gather, tended to be modest: more bread, vegetables, and whatever local produce or fish could be afforded. Meat was a rarity, reserved mostly for festivals or sacrifices when portions were distributed to the public. Yet simplicity didn't mean dullness. Even the poorest households flavored their meals with herbs, garlic, onions, and when possible, a dash of garum. A splash of this pungent fish sauce could turn even stale bread or plain porridge into something resembling a treat. Wine, almost always diluted, was consumed by nearly everyone, ensuring even the humblest meals carried a sense of shared culture. Street food remained a lifeline. Workers without kitchens, travelers passing through, and children running errands all depended on vendors for quick sustenance. A small fried snack or cup of cheap wine might not seem like much, but for the average Roman, these moments offered not only nourishment but also a brief escape from the grind of daily labor. And while the elites indulged in absurd feasts, ordinary Romans found joy in the modest treats within their reach. A honey cake shared at Saturnalia, a fig bought from a market stall, or a rare piece of salted fish was enough to transform an ordinary day into something memorable. The truth is, the vast majority of Romans lived between hunger and indulgence, navigating a diet that was practical yet punctuated with flavor. Their meals may not have made history, but they reveal the everyday heart of Rome, a city fed by bread, beans, and the small pleasures that made life bearable in the shadow of empire. When we look back at the streets of Rome, we don't just see ruins of marble and stone. We can almost smell the smoke of sizzling sausages, the sweetness of honey cakes, the sharp tang of garum hanging in the air. Food, more than monuments, reveals the pulse of a civilization. It tells us what people craved, what they celebrated, and how they survived. For the Romans, eating was never just about sustenance. It was ritual, identity, performance, and sometimes even rebellion. From the humble worker clutching a cup of cheap wine to the emperor reclining at a banquet of impossible excess, every bite carried meaning. Street stalls and banquet halls alike fed not only bodies but also the imagination of a society, constantly balancing discipline with indulgence. And perhaps that is why Rome feels so strangely familiar to us. Their struggles, between hunger and excess, between simplicity and extravagance, are still our struggles. We too live in cities where fast food fuels the working day, where sweets soften the edges of hardship, and where feasts celebrate power, status, or simply the joy of being alive. In the end, what the Romans left us is not only architecture or law, but a mirror. A reminder that the way we eat reflects who we are, what we value, and how we wish to be remembered. So the question lingers. If someone thousands of years from now were to judge our world by its junk food, what story would our snacks and feasts tell about us?